Good morning to everyone. My name is Umberto Tavolato, and I'm the Director of International Relations of the Medor Leonardo Foundation. For those of you who don't know, the Medor Leonardo Foundation, it's a new foundation, Italian, funded by Leonardo, a major defense group in Europe. And it is a foundation that has the missions to build bridges of cooperation and understanding in the wider Mediterranean area. So I'm very pleased today to have the privilege to moderate such a high-level panel on regional tension and global stakes with a focus on the Mediterranean as key to global security. And I think one of the first questions we should ask ourselves is whether the Mediterranean is still key to global security. The highest growth in terms of economic and demographic is happening in another area, the Indo-Pacific. Europe is confronted by a major challenge in the east, not in the south. So it is legitimate to ask whether the Mediterranean is still key to global security. I do believe it is. I do believe it is because, number one, the Mediterranean is not just a sea, it's a region. And it's a region that does not just include the country on the sea, but also what is next to them, from Africa to the wider Middle East. And at the same time as Europe trying to find a way to respond to the challenge of Ukraine and Russia, it couldn't do a worse mistake than to ignore how crucial the Mediterranean is, not just from an economic energy perspective, finding alternative routes, but also from a security one. As long as the Mediterranean Sea is not stable, also Europe will not be stable. So I would like to introduce the panel. On my left, Nikos Christodoulides, a Cypriot academic, politician, and former foreign minister of Cyprus for the last 3 years. Lina, Khatib, a major scholar and director of the Middle East North Africa program at Chatham House. Katrougalos, a Greek jurist, and has served as Foreign Minister of Greece in 2009, and prior to that, Deputy Foreign Minister of Greece from 2016 and 2019. And finally, His Excellency Amre Moussa, that for 20 years has been at the leadership at diplomatic and political level of the Arab world, first as 10 years former Foreign Minister of Egypt, and then for another 10 years, Secretary General of the League of Arab States. So thanks all. And I would like to give the floors first to His Excellency Amre Moussa, and hear from him what do you think are today the major obstacles and challenges that the Mediterranean Sea faces, and if you see some opportunities.
Thank you very much. Yes, I always see some opportunities. We have to. There are a lot of opportunities, in fact. But first of all, I want to challenge the title of this session. That is the regional tensions and international stakes. In fact, it's regional stakes and international tension. The world is in a state of tension, of course. And let me answer your original question. Is the Mediterranean still one of the keys, or the key to international security and stability? I would say that in the age of globalization, there should be several keys, and the Mediterranean is one of them. So that puts it in a way that nobody would oppose such a situation, a position for the Mediterranean. But the Mediterranean and the shores of the Mediterranean, especially the east and south, have witnessed a lot of problems and of tense situations that we in that region, that is called MENA, or somebody like me, I wish to say that I have several identities, being Arab, being Egyptian, being Arab, being African, being Mediterranean. So Our region has witnessed a lot of problems that at the end are similar to what Eurasia is today facing. We have witnessed and lived with invasion, with denial of sovereignty, with violation of territorial integrity, with the resulting in a major question and problem of refugees, tens of millions of refugees. So when we see what we see today happening in Eurasia, we feel sorry indeed, and we wish that all this thing would come to an end that would help peace. But peace is indivisible, and I believe that for the Mediterranean to be really the key towards the peace and security in the world, we have to be honest in dealing with the problems of the Middle East. You cannot condemn the violation of territorial integrity in Europe and look the other way when it comes to the same violation and the same problems for humanity and from human beings in another region, especially when the region is the Middle East, the immediate neighbor of Europe and the immediate neighbor of Eurasia. So, yes, indeed, we need to rethink, and perhaps, as has been said in several panels this morning and yesterday, that what happened in Ukraine, hateful as it is for all of us, of course, is a wake-up call. But this wake-up call has to be a real wake-up call, not to wake up for a certain very narrow point and forget the other. We are at the verge of discussing a new world order. This new world order cannot be just for the sake of one power and against the other powers. This is a major challenge to negotiate a new world order based on the fact that we have to avoid making the same mistakes of double standards. That is the major flaw in the current or the previous, whatever you, world order. Also, so many other humanitarian and economic issues, as we were discussing yesterday. The Mediterranean is also one of the keys for new positive ideas. So while we talk about the negative ideas, the tense situation in all regions around the Mediterranean, or almost all of them, we will have also to think what we should do, especially with the chances of a new project of cooperation in the field of energy. Would this be enough to transform the Middle East, or it is just a small step? And with it, we have to think of many other issues. So I'll stop here and resume later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Nikos Christodoulides, what do you think are the opportunity for regional cooperations in the Mediterranean, particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean, also given the Ukrainian and Russia crisis at the moment?
I would like to connect the crisis in Ukraine with our region, but before that, let me first say that our region, and when I say our region, I mean Eastern Mediterranean and the greater Middle East, because it's very difficult to disconnect the two regions. Our region is mainly known, most of the time, makes headlines for the challenges, the problems, the crisis in the region. But I really believe that there are a lot of also opportunities and a lot of promises in our region. And a few years ago back, the countries of the region, Cyprus, Greece, Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, they came together because they recognize the importance of the regional cooperation, especially on the energy sector. And that is why a few years ago, 2 years ago, we have the establishment in Cairo of the East Med Gas Forum, which is a very important development in our region, with the participation of Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Cyprus, Greece, Palestine, Italy, and now we have France as a member. We have the European Commission as an observer. We have the US government as an observer. So this is, the results of the recognition in the region that working together, especially in the energy sector, actually energy was the trigger point for us to come together. There are a lot of benefits. So having in mind the discussion in Europe and the dependency of Europe from Russia on the energy sector, the Eastern Mediterranean can be an alternative energy route for Europe, having in mind that Europe is looking for alternative energy routes. And I think it's important to mention some data on this issue. The European Union gas imports from Russia that need to be replaced by alternative sources total to 155 BCM per year. The quantities available in the Eastern Mediterranean, and I'm talking in the Cyprus exclusive economic zone and the Israeli exclusive economic zone, amount to about 500 BCM. This means that for a project of 20 years, the Eastern Mediterranean will be able to contribute 25 BCM per year, which is about 15 to 16% of Russian gas imports to the European Union. And this is not a negligible percentage at all. So it is very important for the European Union to invest in the region. And there are a number of ways to export gas from the region to Europe. I know very well that there are some concerns, especially from the United States. Recently, Ms. Victoria Nuland, she was in Greece, she was in Cyprus, she expressed concern about the economic viability of a pipeline from Israel to Cyprus to Greece and from there to Europe. But this pipeline is not the only option. There are also other options that we should examine. For example, there are 2 LNGs in Egypt that we can take advantage, taking the gas in Egypt and from there to Europe. So our region can play a very important role on the energy security of the European Union. And I expect both from the European Union, the European Commission, but also from the countries of the region to come together in order to examine this prospect.
May I ask you, this is great. How can geopolitical competition within the region and outside complicate this decision?
As I mentioned at the beginning of my intervention, the countries of the region recognize the benefits out of the regional cooperation. So energy was a trigger point to come together. Right now, the countries of the region, all the countries of the region, they are working together in a number of other fields because all of us, we recognize that we can benefit out of the regional cooperation. What we are asking is respect of the international law. There are some basic prerequisites, respect of the international law, of the territorial integrity of the countries of the region, and we are working on a positive agenda without excluding any country of the region, as long as they respect what I mentioned before.
Thank you very much. Mr. Katrougalos, would you agree with what your colleagues has just said?
Yes, and not just because we are close friends. Let's start from the big picture. There is a triangle of insecurity now in Europe. 2 of its 3 points are in the Mediterranean. Ukraine, first one, Syria, and Libya. And of course, we have 2 open chronic wounds, Palestinian issue and the Cypriot issue. Who are the players outside the directly involved? My first remark is that it is still a multipolar world. President Biden has tried to contact the leaders of Saudi Arabia and the Emirates to ask them to raise the production of oil. The news is not that they have not accepted. There is already a decision of OPEC Plus for that. The big news is that they did not take the call. They told him, call tomorrow. That would be unthinkable during the Cold War Can you imagine the President of the United States to call any country and the leader say, who is Nixon? Bah, tell him to call tomorrow. This is happening exactly because now we are not anymore in the dominance of one superpower, United States, not in a bipolar world, but in a world of many, many competitors. So the big question is how we found rules in this world. My first answer is that we must not have double standards, as already has been said. We have been all against the war in Ukraine and we condemned the Russian invasion. The same must be true for everybody, in any case, not just in Europe, in the world. The second is we must find ways to promote cooperation, which is the key here, the one that Nikos has already said, respect of the rules, that is, respect of international law. Together with Nikos, we have been the two ministers of foreign affairs when we had the big political agreement of the 3+1 and the agreement to build the East Med pipeline. The exact next day, I have traveled to Antalya to meet my counterpart, Çavuşoğlu, with a clear message. This initiative is not aimed to exclude you. You can have a participation in the equation of energy in the East Mediterranean. Are there conditions? No. One just natural condition, you should respect the law of the sea and international law. If we have agreement on that, we can proceed. A last remark regarding the role of Greece. Greece has never been a colonial power. Greece has also always acted as a kind of bridge between our political home, which is the European Union, and other major political forces, China, Russia, the Arab world. Therefore, we are very much against a shift of policies during the present Greek administration, who they had decided, for instance, to send patriots and Greek troops in Saudi Arabia to fight in an intra-Arab war between Sunni and Shia, and among us, a dirty war, which is already under investigation by the United Nations for crimes against humanity. And Prime Minister Mitsotakis has reversed the doctrine of foreign policy that would be this bridge, going back to another metaphor used during the Cold War, that Greece should be the Western outpost in the area, or the cap. This is not in the interest of Greece. This is not in the interest of the European Union, which, and this is my last remark, it's as a European Union, and not as a France, Italy, Greece, highly absent in the area. If we want to avoid the return to a bipolar world after the end of the war in Ukraine, which will be much worse than the previous, exactly because we do not have rules. We do not have any kind of security channels. The only way to avoid that is that Europe has its own independent voice at the international scene and its own autonomous defense vis-à-vis NATO. We should, all Europeans, try to achieve this goal, and the added value of Greece in such a Europe would be exactly to be the bridge between our political home and the other major players.
Thank you very much. I think I see two big elephants in the room. One is Turkey and one is Russia. And I want to focus on the second, so relax, all of you.
They are natural allies.
Yes. And I want to give to Lina, Khatib the floor and just give us a broad view on Russia's interest, especially in the Middle East, but also in the Mediterranean. And do you think that in case of protracted war in Ukraine, there is the possibility of Russia using the southern border of Europe to put pressure on Europe?
Okay, thank you. Well, actually, I want to start with looking at what many had taken for granted in this region, which is the so-called Iran-Russian dominated security architecture, mainly on the Levant side of the Mediterranean. Because of Russia's dominance in Syria, because of Iran's dominance in Syria, a lot of people took this for granted. However, what we're seeing now in Ukraine and the problems that Russia is facing there shows us that Russia appeared strong in Syria because it faced such weak resistance in Syria, not necessarily because Russia itself is almighty. So perhaps taking this security architecture for granted has been a bit of an overestimation of Russia's power and also Iran's. So what I'm saying is it's not fait accompli. For a while, US disengagement in particular allowed this security architecture to kind of set roots. But what we really need to think about is that whatever the West decides to do on Ukraine, vis-à-vis Russia, will have a domino effect on the Mediterranean and the Middle East. And so stay with me, because this is a bit of a domino that I'm talking about. Let's start with Turkey very briefly. If we look at what Turkey is doing now between Russia and Ukraine, it's really Russia-US. Turkey is trying to kind of, in a way, strike a balance between the two. But what the news is not really reporting right now is how Turkey is escalating its bombardment in northeast Syria against the Kurds. And this is upsetting, actually, the Russians and the Americans. If we zoom in on Syria itself and what is happening in Syria, we'll see when it comes to Russia that this is actually a low-cost, high-gain investment. And it's very likely that Russia will want to hold on to this investment and this influence in Syria. Meanwhile, we heard about countries like UAE standing up to the United States and not necessarily heeding what the US wants the UAE to do. And one of the things that UAE has been doing is push towards normalization with the Assad regime of Syria. Now, if this happens, this normalization happens, this would give Russia and Iran, that is very dominant in Syria, a lifeline, a financial lifeline. And this would be definitely destabilizing for the Mediterranean. At the very least, let's think about the Captagon trade, the drug trade, that is dominated by Iran-backed groups, where Syria and Lebanon have been a hub of this. And these drugs are reaching Europe. They're reaching even places like Germany, not necessarily just Mediterranean countries in Europe. So it is a worldwide problem that is definitely linked to the conflict in Syria. So we can't really ignore it. And when it comes to Libya, here we have a bit of an interesting situation because Russia seems to have taken a bit of a step back in Libya. And now, with the Wagner Group mercenaries that Russia is using in its war against Ukraine, in Libya, already before the Ukraine crisis started, Haftar, who was one of supposedly Russia's allies in this fight, had at one point said that he actually doesn't want these mercenaries to stay for too long, and that was mainly because he was trying to appeal to the US to regard him as legitimate. But now there are reports of some of the Wagner-trained mercenaries being sent to Ukraine. So to me, it looks like, although it's unpredictable what Russia might do next in Libya, but it looks like there's a bit of a reduction. So here I see opportunities. And the three things that I talked about, there are opportunities when it comes to Turkey, when it comes to Syria, and when it comes to Libya. And here are opportunities for the West. With Libya, if Russia is going to really start reducing its involvement on the ground, then definitely here's an opportunity for the West to push for the peaceful process to kind of progress forward. And of course, a stable Libya is always good news for the Mediterranean, especially when you think about the numbers of refugees and migrants who have been using Libya as a kind of foothold, and also, of course, all kinds of mercenaries and militias operating. Second, with Turkey, we are seeing now the US try to engage Turkey more, because Turkey is trying to do this balancing act, but there is increasing effort to try to pull it towards the West. And if this happens, then it's a good thing. And it will have a positive impact on Syria as well, especially potentially open up space for Turkey and the US to collaborate on the northeast-northwest Syria front. And when it comes to Russia, as I said, it is very keen on Syria. But if the West increases sanctions on Syria and imposes, sanctions on Russia and imposes an oil embargo on Russia, then this would make it harder for countries like UAE, who want to normalize with the Assad regime, to actually go ahead. Because any normalization with the Assad regime, with these sanctions in place, would mean having to cross Western sanctions, and the UAE will ultimately not want that. So a tougher stance on Russia by the West is going to have a trickle-down effect on how countries in the region deal with Syria. So, in a way, Syria could be part of the bargain with Russia. And finally, all this would, of course, impact Iran. I'm not going to go into the details of Iran in general. However, again, the Western disengagement and the focus of many countries on the nuclear deal with Iran and ignoring its regional role has also allowed the security architecture to get some hold. And there's no need for us to accept that. Now is a good time. With all these things that I talked about, it's a good time to try to at least contain Iran's influence in the Levant side of the Mediterranean, if I can call it that. So in general, what I'm saying is the West needs to think about how its actions in the context of the war on Ukraine can actually create a dent in the Russia-Iran dominated security architecture in the Levant side of the Med. Thank you.
Thank you very much for mapping out very comprehensively and shortly the great challenges that we face in the regions. I would like to go back to Dr. Amre Moussa on a more specific question, linking it up to what she was just saying. It seems to me that exactly at the time when Europe is busy with geopolitically with Ukraine, Russia, it seems absence in Africa and the Middle East in terms of engagement geopolitically. At the same time, we have in the Arab world a moment of major diplomatic engagement, the escalations between countries in the Gulf, Israel, in North Africa with Egypt playing a critical role, Turkey also being now fully part of this consultation and engagement. Is there a new Arab order emerging? And I think this is a critical question that one needs to ask when it comes to the Mediterranean, because often European forgets that the majority of the Mediterraneans is not just only Muslim, it's Sunni, and it's majority Arab. So as we think about new world order, I think the Mediterranean will be very much influenced about whether there is a chance for a new Arab order.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, there is a chance. But we must talk about Arab order and regional order at the same time. We should not separate them from each other. And we have been thinking of that ever since this so-called Arab Spring. We found that the theories, the strategies, the policies, especially of Western powers, with the title Creative Anarchy, that created a lot of anarchy in the Middle East and in Eastern Mediterranean, we were thinking of, okay, now we might have lost that decade after what happened, but we have to look for a better future. And we cannot do that without mapping out a new order, regional order, and a new regional structure. This regional structure, in fact, started well before the so-called Arab Spring. I myself, as the Secretary General of the League of Arab States, at the final couple of years of my tenure, proposed formally to the summit of the Arab League that we establish a policy of neighboring countries of the Arab region. The neighboring countries should include, by definition, Africans, Asians, and Mediterraneans, and also possibly Southern Europeans. This would have created a community of countries coming from different areas, perhaps with different cultures, but creating interests, common interests among all of them. And we had a very, very, what can I say, sharp debate where the Secretary General was defeated. No, that's out of the question. We cannot just open up the... after the Arab Spring, I met some of them. I said, yes, we were sorry. We should have accepted that because this would have started a new alignment of Mediterraneans, Arabs, Africans, etc. So this is the idea. The idea is a regional order. Here comes the point of the projects of energy in Eastern Mediterranean. Would this be enough to launch a new order in the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean, Southern Mediterranean, etc.? I would say, yes, it is a good beginning, but it is not enough. What would complete the picture and add to it and push it further is to address the security concerns in both Eastern Mediterranean and Southern Mediterranean. Just to make it easier for the sake of debate, Syria and Libya. Though those are two examples of instability without ignoring at all the Palestinian question. Okay. Because the Palestinian question lies, in fact, under all the tensions we have and the problems we have. And I believe firmly that the Palestinian question is still very much alive. And if it doesn't solve today, it will pop up tomorrow or after tomorrow and so on. The order I am thinking of has to have the cultural compartment, the political, the economic, and the security. And we are capable of drawing this. We are capable if we sit together and talk reason. Israel has a role to play on this. Israel has to change its policy and cooperate in solving the Palestinian question. Arab countries have changed. There are a lot of new thinking and actions and policies. I don't see that on the part of Israel, nothing new. So the point is that now, with this nucleus, we cooperate in energy. Why don't we cooperate in other issues, not only economic, but in creating an atmosphere conducive to this new regional order, where the Arab order would play a very positive role, because it is not a question, we don't have an ideological difference with Israel. Our history that goes back thousands of years didn't have any confrontation, major confrontation like us and Persia, like us and Turkey, Ottoman Turkey. So there was no problem. The problem started with the issue of Palestine only 70, 75 years ago. So if we can solve that, we need Israel's change of mind. And there is really a chance for a new order.
Very clear, thank you. Do you agree with it? And how do we make Europe a bit more engaged?
I fully agree with Mr. Moussa. You know, the perception in the region is that the West, and especially the United States, is disengaging from the region, or there is a selective, I will say, engagement. This creates a vacuum. This vacuum should be filled by the countries of the region working together. And we have the example of energy, which is a starting point. It's not the end of the road, but it is a starting point. And we need to build on this cooperation. There is a great role for Europe. Both Cyprus and Greece will always make the case in Brussels for the need for the European Union to be much more engaged in the region, to have a holistic, I will say, approach, because right now we don't, as Europeans, having a holistic approach in the region. And we need to have a clear vision and support the regional cooperation. I will finish by saying that, you know, we cannot change geography. If it was possible, we will move Cyprus next to Switzerland. It will be much better, believe me, having in mind Turkey. It's not possible. So our geography is our destiny, and we need to work together.
Thank you. I leave to you to conclude, the both of you, Lina and Mr. Katrougalos. I have a specific questions for Lina. Do you see we have seen subsequent vote in the United Nations General Assembly with a lot of Arab countries, as well as African, and not necessarily everyone has strategic relation with Russia, deciding to be neutral or abstain. And it was a shock in Europe. Do you see a sense of fatigue vis-à-vis Europe and the West in this part of the world?
Well, there is a sense of disappointment rather than fatigue. And, for example, the position of UAE has been interesting in that regard. In fact, in one of, not the latest vote on the human rights issue, but the previous one, it was Israel that convinced UAE to vote for that resolution, which is another reason why I think we should definitely encourage regional cooperation in the Middle East. However, it's also a warning sign, you know, that the UAE had been regarded for quite some time as a trusted, kind of reliable US partner, and it's doing its own thing because of disappointment, mainly with the US stance on Iran. So that's why I brought Iran into the conversation. This, you know, you call it fatigue, I call it disappointment. It's mainly because lots of countries in the region have been struggling with Iran's regional role. We're seeing this playing out in the Gulf region. We're seeing this playing out in Syria and Lebanon. And yet, the West has just focused on the nuclear issue as if it's compartmentalized, and it's not. So here, I think it's also a Western burden to not address the elephant in the room, that is Iran's regional role, has been a huge mistake. It has allowed this so-called security architecture that I talked about to kind of get a foothold. But now is a good time to address it. It's not too late.
Thank you. And I would like to leave to our Greek speaker, our host, the privilege to conclude.
Well, just to take in the lead of the previous speaker, I find very rational many countries in the world not to want to go back either to a bipolar world or to a world dominated by the United States. And we Europeans must clearly see our responsibility for not trying to build, first of all, our own autonomous position in the international scene, what I said before, European Union, not to be, as Juncker was saying, a global payer, just giving money to humanitarian aid, but a real global player. We had a second failure, not be able to have a European architecture for security that would include Russia. That was possible in the final decade of the previous century and the first decade of this one. OSCE has made clear the contour of such an architecture. The security of the one not to be to the detriment of the other. This is not to excuse the Russian invasion. We have all clearly condemned it. But we must also clearly see our responsibilities. So for the future, we must try to build a world without dominance of any power. We have seen that the interventions of the United States in the area have actually reinforced Iran's position. We have seen that in Iraq. We have seen that in Afghanistan. Nobody should see the Mediterranean as a European lake. It is not. We must work, as it has been very clearly said, with the Arabs and Turkey to make it a better place for everybody. The only condition, juridically, legally, is respect of international law, and the only political condition is inclusivity and respect, of course, of the rules of the game.
Thank you very much. I think I couldn't summarize better the discussions and the conclusions, and I wish you a good stay in Delphi.
Thank you.
Thank you.